The air in Yangshan Port never truly settles. It's a toxic mix of diesel particulate, salt spray, and highly controlled paranoia. I was Mei Lin, a junior analyst contracted by Sino-Ocean Logistics, responsible for tracking intermodal transfers. My actual mission, set for 0200, was a wet drop retrieval from the hull of the M/V Dragon's Teeth, a bulk carrier sailing under a Panamanian flag, but carrying high-priority PLA Navy components. My contact, codename Ping, was supposed to signal the container ID confirming the data package placement. Hour 0 arrived, and the static was deafening. Not radio static, but the kind of environmental noise that screams compromise. The floodlights illuminating the terminal were too bright, the security patrols too regimented, and the automated container crane movements were operating at 95% efficiency, a suspicious level of precision for a Tuesday night. I was watching the CCTV feeds from a maintenance office, using a bespoke loop injection to maintain the illusion of routine. Ping's assigned signal, container MSCU 547891, never materialized on the manifest scrolling across my monitor. I ran the thermal scans on the target vessel. Nothing unusual on deck. The water, however, felt heavy. My internal clock was ticking down the window of opportunity. The Shanghai Bureau of the Ministry of State Security, MSS, is a known entity, methodical and brutally patient. If Ping had been lifted, they wouldn't stop the operation. They would let it run, using the container ship as bait. I killed the CCTV feed injection for a 2-second blink, allowing raw data to filter. The change was minuscule. One specific gantry crane near Dock 4 was decelerating its movements by 0.3 meters per second. Insignificant to the naked eye, but that crane serviced the precise berth where Ping was due to work. It was a digital hiccup in a highly automated system, indicating human override, likely an MSS sniper position setting up a clear field of fire. The wet drop was a trap, but where was the payload? I couldn't abort without the intelligence. The mission profile required extracting Ping's data on the PLA's new magneto-hydrodynamic propulsion system. Failure was not an option. I needed to move dockside, away from the relative safety of the office, and into the absolute exposure of the yard, where the air itself felt monitored by acoustic sensors trained on every footfall and mechanical groan. My cover was fraying before I even stepped outside the controlled environment of my false identity. The shift in operational parameters demanded immediate, aggressive adaptation. If the physical drop was compromised, Ping must have activated the secondary protocol, an acoustic transmission burst. This meant the data, likely compressed to the size of a cigarette pack, was attached directly to the hull, awaiting retrieval by a submersible or diver team. Since my extraction team was hours away and focused on the original container scenario, I was alone. I grabbed the hydroacoustic receiver, HARP, disguised as a bulky radiation dosimeter, standard equipment for port analysts dealing with nuclear cargo, and clipped it to my belt. The real challenge was proximity. To get a reliable lock and download, I needed to be within 10 meters of the waterline, directly underneath the target ship. I fabricated a maintenance request for substandard mooring tensioning on the Dragon's Teeth and printed a fake work order, complete with forged safety clearances. Walking the gantries felt like stepping onto a high-tension wire. The port environment is designed to register mass and movement. Every shadow, every vibration is mapped. The moment I reached the primary mooring line, I activated the HARP. The screen remained blank. Then, a ghost of a sound, a high-frequency chirp, buried deep beneath the relentless thrum of the ship's idle generator. It wasn't the encrypted data burst, it was a homing beacon. Ping had initiated the wet signal, a distress call signifying imminent capture. He hadn't just been taken. The MSS were likely listening to the beacon, waiting for a retrieval asset to surface. I had walked into a live, acoustic listening post. I killed the HARP instantly. I realized the data wasn't waiting to be downloaded. It was being continually broadcast via a low-power, single-use transponder attached to the rudder post. My job wasn't to receive the signal. It was to physically retrieve the transmitting device before the MSS used its signal to target my backup extraction team. The time window shrank from hours to minutes. I had to go into the water, now, and the silence from the MSS indicated they were confident the spy was already located, or soon would be. They were patient hunters, knowing their target had nowhere to go but the water. Infiltrating the docks required a sudden change in costume and mindset. I shed the logistics analyst persona, discarding the high-visibility vest and the hard hat, and adopted the role of a maintenance crew auxiliary. I slipped into a utility alcove near a massive ballast tank overflow pipe, retrieving a borrowed pair of neoprene waders and a small, battery-powered hydro cutter from a pre-positioned cache. The odor of industrial lubricant and stagnant seawater was overwhelming, a blessing in disguise as it masked my human scent. The distance to the Dragon's Teeth rudder post was agonizingly short, yet the journey involved crossing 4 lanes of automated cargo shuttles and scaling a sheer concrete quay wall. I used the noise of a passing container train as cover, vaulting a chain-link fence and landing softly in the gravel exclusion zone. The hydro cutter was crucial. The transponder was likely magnetic, but protected by a proprietary coating that needed to be sheared away before extraction. I lowered myself into the oily, dark water. The cold was shocking, instantly numbing my exposed hands. Submerging beneath the surface offered temporary acoustic sanctuary, drowning out the omnipresent industrial roar. I swam blind, relying entirely on the unique vibrations of the target vessel's massive propeller shaft. I reached the stern, clinging to the immense steel rudder. The transponder was exactly where Ping had placed it, a small, barnacle-encrusted metal disc. I activated the hydro cutter. The whine was dangerously loud underwater, but the depth charges already being tested miles away masked the brief sound. I wrestled the device free, tucking it into a watertight pocket inside my waders. The moment I breached the surface, gasping, the world tilted. The silent expectation of the MSS had ended. The air was split by the rapid arrival of uniformed PLA Naval Security personnel. They weren't reacting to me. They were reacting to the water itself. A searchlight beam, thick as a tree trunk, swept the bay. The signal I had just cut must have been silent for a few minutes too long. They weren't looking for a lone swimmer. They were looking for a submerged threat. The alarm was sounded, suspected infiltration by a foreign submarine asset. The hunt was now official and terrifyingly asymmetrical. I was standing in ankle-deep sludge on the quay, the retrieved transponder data secured, but the PLA Navy's response was disproportionate, cinematic, and catastrophic for my planned exit. I heard the unmistakable low-frequency hum of active sonar sweeping the deep channels, the sound a naval destroyer makes when it's serious. Then, the confirmation, the distant, powerful, rhythmic ping, ping, ping of a Kilo-class subhunt. The Kilo-class is Russia's export submarine, highly effective and often employed by the PLA for coastal defense and intimidation. If they were sweeping for a Kilo, or something equally substantial, they had been fed intelligence suggesting a major foreign power deployment, likely believing I was the scout for a large SEAL team extraction vessel. 2 large gray vessels, likely Type 056 corvettes, were speeding toward the terminal, floodlights blazing, their wakes churning the already murky water. I sprinted toward the cover of the container stacks, the sonar pings echoing through the concrete structure like a massive heartbeat. Every shadow was now a potential threat. My greatest enemy was their focused paranoia. They were dedicating all resources to the water, ignoring the land. This tunnel vision was my only chance. I shed the waders near a diesel refueling depot and reverted to my logistics gear, attempting to melt back into the background noise of the port. The transponder in my pocket was burning a hole in my cover. It was physically hot, having just finished its short-burst transmission cycle. A naval security team, clad in dark fatigues, secured the perimeter of the quay I had just exited, their rifles scanning the water, not the land. I overheard garbled radio chatter. Negative contact on deep sonar, expanding search grid to Sector 3. Maintain acoustic silence. Priority: foreign hull identification. I had to put maximum distance between myself and the active naval zone immediately. The dock was turning into a kill box, surrounded by highly sophisticated ASW, anti-submarine warfare, equipment looking for a target that was actually walking, dry, just meters away. The irony was palpable. The sheer scale of the deception was saving my life. I needed deep cover, immediately. The container yard was too exposed, too open to drone surveillance, which would switch from water-focused to air-focused once the deep sweep failed. I opted for the belly of the beast, the subterranean network beneath the main customs processing facility. This labyrinth of maintenance tunnels, originally built for fiber optic cables and utility access, offered thermal opacity and acoustic dampening. I slipped through a rusty access hatch marked "Danger," high voltage, and descended into the stifling darkness. The tunnel air was thick with radon and the metallic tang of old wiring. For the next 36 hours, this became my refuge. Time dissolved into an endless loop of hypervigilance. I subsisted on nutrient paste and filtered condensate dripping from overhead pipes. My immediate task was to analyze the data on the transponder, the PLA's propulsion breakthrough. I used the specialized decryptor unit hidden inside the harp shell. The process was slow, agonizingly sensitive to vibration and power fluctuations. Outside, I could hear the constant rumble of the hunt. Now and then, a localized, heavy thud would vibrate the concrete floor beneath me, testing charges, designed to shake out anything clinging silently to the seabed. The sound was a constant reminder of my proximity to lethal force. My paranoia reached a new peak. The tunnels were supposedly dead zones for surveillance, but I checked every junction box, every drain grate, convinced an acoustic filament microphone had been dropped or a chemical sensor deployed to detect human respiration. I moved every 2 hours, leaving behind microtracers, dust-sized sensors, to detect any post-facto intrusion. I worked under the narrow beam of a red-filtered headlamp. The data began to resolve. Schematics for a superconducting magnet array, capable of generating near-silent, non-cavitation thrust. It was revolutionary, justifying the massive naval response outside. But the data held something else, far more personal. A coded message appended by ping, executed seconds before his capture. They expect a team of 4, male, deep-water trained, focusing on the silent runner, egress boat. Avoid the water entirely. Do not contact extraction. The 36-hour data decryption provided the critical pivot point. Ping's sacrifice yielded the intelligence, but more importantly, the MSS's flawed tactical expectation. They were hunting ghosts in the water, the silent runner mini-sub I was originally supposed to rendezvous with. This fixation on a maritime threat meant the landside security, while heavy, was focusing on perimeter hardening rather than deep internal sweeps. The pressure was intense. My body was running on pure adrenaline and the stale tunnel air. I was physically drained, but the knowledge that they were looking for 4 men, not 1 woman, was a powerful psychological boost. I abandoned the initial extraction plan involving a high-speed catamaran pickup miles offshore. The water was a death sentence, actively patrolled by ASW frigates. I needed to go inland, leveraging the massive, high-volume logistical traffic of the port itself. My new extraction vector was the high-speed freight rail line that connected Yangshan directly to the inland distribution hubs. It was a 5-kilometer overland sprint, across open yards and through the electrical substation grid, an area designed for automated efficiency and zero human interference. The risk was extreme. 1 false step, 1 triggered proximity sensor, and I would be silhouetted against the night sky. The transponder data, secured on an encrypted solid-state module, was now taped to my abdomen. I stripped down to basic fatigues and repacked my limited kit, discarding anything unnecessary, including the now useless harp. The plan was fixed: reach the rail yard and ride the rails into the urban sprawl, where I could vanish among millions. I waited until 4 o'clock. The moment the shift change created a predictable, if fleeting, reduction in human security patrols. I had to time my ascent from the tunnels precisely with the passing of the 4:15 MSS roving patrol. There was no room for error. The environment was unforgiving, and the enemy was paranoid, armed, and backed by a national intelligence apparatus that was currently obsessed with sinking a submarine that didn't exist. The ascent was a moment of sheer physical terror. Emerging from the maintenance hatch, I was immediately exposed to the floodlights and the biting wind off the East China Sea. The time window was 20 seconds. I sprinted across the concrete apron toward the elevated gantry crane lines. These lines, stretching like metallic dinosaurs across the port, offered a degree of visual cover but amplified every sound. I was running parallel to the active freight rail lines, dodging the immense automated straddle carriers that moved containers like building blocks. I used the noise generated by a nearby diesel generator to mask my heavy breathing and the crunch of my boots on the ballastone. Suddenly, my peripheral vision caught movement. A black MSS sweep team, for men, dressed in low-visibility armor, conducting a systematic grid search of the open storage yards near the main administration building. They were still hunting for something substantial, likely evidence of the landing party they assumed had preceded the mini-sub. I flattened myself between two massive, empty flatbed containers destined for Russia. The MSS team passed within meters. They were communicating via secure bone-conducting mics, their focus intense but narrow, restricted to looking for footprints or disturbed equipment. I realized my small frame and Mei Lin's established presence in the logistics system provided a psychological defense. They were looking for highly trained intruders, not a slight woman in a utility uniform. The smell of ozone and burnt oil from the overhead electrical lines was overwhelming as I darted under the rail bridge leading to the main marshalling yard. The rail yard was chaos, but structured chaos, a perfect place to disappear. I was close, but the psychological strain of evading the focused, technologically superior hunter was starting to erode my concentration. I fought the urge to rush, forcing myself to maintain the slow, methodical pace required for maximum silence and stealth. The noise of the kilo hunt, the distant, resonating pong of heavy sonar, was fading, replaced by the immediate, life-or-death proximity of the MSS ground team. The intermodal maze of the rail yard was a graveyard of kinetic energy. Thousands of steel containers, stacked 4 high, formed artificial canyons that offered cover but also created inescapable dead ends. This was where the final MSS perimeter was likely to be set, focusing on ingress/egress points. I had to think like a commodity, not a human. I navigated the narrow gaps between the stacks, maintaining a low crouch. My movements were governed by the schedules of the yard shunter locomotives. The rhythmic clanging of couplers and the hiss of air brakes were the musical beats of my escape. I located the target line, Track 7, designated for a high-priority early morning run to a major inland manufacturing zone, hundreds of kilometers away. The stress was manifesting as auditory hallucinations. I kept hearing Ping's acoustic chirp, even though the device was secured and dead. I reached the staging area. The freight cars were being assembled, a mix of flatbeds, open hoppers, and covered boxcars. I needed a conveyance that offered both security and ease of exit. A refrigerated boxcar, reefer unit, offered the best bet. They are typically secured externally, but the constant hum of the chilling unit provides excellent acoustic cover. I used a specialized, silent pry tool to access the rear maintenance panel of a reefer unit marked Qingdao Cold Storage. The panel opened into the narrow channel between the insulation and the outer shell, a tight squeeze, but thermally invisible and acoustically damp. I curled up in the freezing space, the hum of the compressor vibrating through my bones. I was inside the machine, an inert piece of cargo. I monitored the activity outside through a tiny, pre-drilled vent hole. Yard engineers were performing final checks, but the MSS presence was subtle. 2 non-uniformed men with earpieces leaning against a stack of pallets, observing the boarding process with unnatural intensity. They weren't checking the cargo. They were checking the operators. They still didn't suspect a stowaway. The train began to move, slowly at first, a metallic groan of release as the mass shifted. The movement was exquisite, a silent promise of distance. Inside the refrigerated channel, the cold began to leach my body heat, forcing me to focus solely on breath control and minimizing shivering. The journey from the staging yard to the main line junction was the most dangerous, as the train was moving slowly enough for a quick boarding by security. At the first major junction, I prepared for the final test. The MSS, knowing the impossibility of finding a ghost sub, would be widening their dragnet. They would have activated facial recognition on all major rail and road arteries leading out of the port zone. My only defense was the flaw in their intelligence, the expectation of a male operative. I waited until the train reached cruising speed, about 80 kilometers per hour, making an interception difficult and dangerous. I checked the geopositioning on my miniature wrist-mounted GPS, 30 kilometers from the docks, crossing the perimeter of the major urban surveillance grid. It was time for the final jump. I exited the reefer's maintenance panel, climbing onto the roof of the boxcar. The wind was fierce, and the sparks from the overhead electrical wire danced violently in the pre-dawn sky. I needed to reach the next junction, where the train slowed significantly to switch tracks, dropping me into a forested rural area outside the immediate MSS zone. I traversed 3 boxcars, the metal slick with condensation. Looking back, I could just make out the haze of the Shanghai lights and the faint, almost unheard resonance of the naval hunt still consuming the deep water. The junction arrived. The train groaned, the coupling slack tightened, and the pace dropped to 20 kilometers per hour. I took a deep breath, calculating the roll and speed, and leaped sideways, tucking into a controlled roll down the embankment, disappearing into the cover of thick bamboo groves. The physical impact was jarring, knocking the air from my lungs, but the silence, save for the rhythmic clicking of the rail wheels receding in the distance, was absolute freedom. The final handover occurred 6 hours later, deep in the relative safety of an abandoned tea plantation near Suzhou. My local contact, an elderly woman disguised as a farmer, met me by a dry irrigation canal. There were no words, only recognition. The encrypted module containing the magneto-hydrodynamic propulsion schematics was exchanged for a clean set of documents and cash. The 72-hour window had closed. Reflecting on the mission during the long, winding drive back to the secondary exfiltration point, the true terror wasn't the MSS patrols or the near misses on the track. It was the knowledge that I had been hunted by a naval asset, a destroyer and potentially a submarine, while standing on dry land. The paranoia instilled by that Kilo-class sweep became a permanent fixture in my operational memory. They had deployed the full weight of the PLA Navy to neutralize a threat that was the size of a cigarette pack, carried by a lone woman. The detail in their response was terrifying, but the systemic flaw in their assumptions, their inability to conceive of a threat that defied their established parameters of deep-water espionage, was what saved me. The cost was high. Ping was gone, a hero whose sacrifice secured the most critical naval intelligence package of the decade. The mission reinforced the fundamental rule of operating in a surveillance state like China. The biggest threat isn't the technology they deploy, but the flawed human intelligence that directs it. I survived 72 hours surrounded by the military might of a superpower because they were looking for a shadow in the water, and I was the ghost moving silently on the land.